All right, I think that's everybody. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining tonight. I'm Finn. I help coordinate the Hare's Corner, and with me I have Rob Gandola and Sharon Parr. Rob is one of our pond advisors for the Hare's Corner, and Sharon is one of our Plan for Nature advisors. So, for those of you who haven't been to any of these clinics before, these are monthly webinars we hold on the second Monday of each month, and anyone can come and ask questions about the topic that we have for the month, and they're funded by Life's Too Good Foundation, which is how we can have them free and open to everybody. So today we were meant to have Aoife O'Rourke talking about pond enhancement, but unfortunately she's sick. So Rob has very kindly stepped into the reach. So since it was very short notice, we won't have a presentation today. We'll just do a Q&A on wildlife ponds. But Rob has loads of experience building ponds, not just working with the Hare's Corner, but he also worked on Antarctica's Ponds for Biodiversity project and a million other things. Maybe I can't name them all. So he can, I'm sure, cover any question that comes up. So we'll just jump right in. And I'll start with the questions that we've had emailed in so far. So the first question we have, actually, this was from a colleague in the office who was wondering about her pond, which is a small garden pond, which has become sort of filled in. It's not actually that old, only 3 years old, but it's been already very filled in with vegetation and silted up, kind of. So she knows that, you're only supposed to remove a certain portion, like a third of the vegetation each year. But she was wondering about how to go about, like, whether she should be removing kind of the silt from the bottom and how to go about that.
Yeah, so like dividing it up into a percentage to manage is the smart way of doing it. And for anybody who doesn't know what this is, it's essentially you would sit an imaginary grid over your pond and you would divide it into whatever kind of number of units blocks that you would think is sufficient. So normally you'd say you'd never manage more than 25% a year, so you might divide your pond into quarters, and that way then you'd manage a quarter and it would take you 4 years. And by management I mean you could really go to town on that one quarter. Like you could heavily cut back the vegetation, you could remove some of the sludge from the bottom, you could even take it all back just to completely bare space if you really wanted to. um, and the reason why you'd leave the other 75% as they are is because you've only shocked the system in that one small area. So your beneficial bacteria in the sludge that's remaining is still there to keep your water clean. You haven't upset the apple cart in terms of your vegetation that's already established. And then within 6 months to a year now, you're going to have a little bit of grow back, which will happen naturally. Either the plants that are already there will spread into an empty space, or if it's not empty space and you've just heavily cut back your vegetation, they will grow back, but they'll be at a very different kind of height or thickness or density or whatever to the other plants that are in the pond. And what this does is it creates further microhabitats and microclimates even within the pond itself. And what that will do is increase your diversity, and overall, again, you just don't want to shock the system to the point where you completely upset the apple cart, and what you end up down is with green pea soup. That the pond system can't balance if you do too much at the one time. It's exactly the same when you think about how you'd manage an aquarium, with expensive fish. You'd always leave a little bit in the bottom to keep the bacteria in the filter and the bacteria in the tank running smoothly. It's no different from your pond.
Mm, great. Yeah, thanks. Um, and then I suppose this is kind of the topic we would have been covering. Someone has asked about how to encourage more animals and plants to the pond. So, I guess enhancing your pond to make it more beneficial for biodiversity and wildlife.
Yeah, so this is going to be really subjective and specific to your pond as you find it. Um, with lined ponds, and what I mean with lined ponds, like artificial liner, so with the rubber liners, the butyl liners, and things like that. If you speak to botanists, they'll tell you to introduce nothing, but the chances of a rubber lined pond colonizing on its own is quite low, and it's going to be very, very slow. So, it's not going to be appealing to an awful lot of wildlife. If your pond all of a sudden has found itself in an awful lot of shade, it's not going to be hugely appealing. So what you may do in those cases is you might go and get some native aquatic plants. They are becoming more available from people growing them in Ireland, and then you might put them in. So some nice low and colorful plants, something like marsh marigolds, or if you wanted something around the edge, you might put in your cuckoo flower and things like that. So you get that burst of color in the spring that will also attract in things like your orange tip butterflies. Or you might just have to cut a few branches to get the light back underwater. So enhancing your pond for wildlife, there's a million things you could suggest, but it's all really dependent on the type of the pond, and as you find it as well, what you think the problem is. A lot of people in urban areas in particular will struggle to get what they see as the main drivers of diversity, which are your frogs and your newts. And the problem with frogs and newts is they can't fly. So unless they're within generally 250 to 500 meters of your garden pond, and they have access to the pond. So if you're in a terraced house, it's going to be very difficult for them to find their way in. It's almost impossible that they're going to find their way in. But for things like dragonflies and the birds that are going to use it like a bath, and other invertebrates, so like your hoverflies, some of which will have an aquatic nymph or larval stage, they should be able to find it fairly handy. Once your pond is meeting the criteria of nice shallow edges, or at least a shallow lip somewhere where the water can be kind of very kind of warm, slightly nutrient rich, and have some vegetation in it. And that's really it. You use your vegetation to your advantage. Small ponds obviously will succeed quicker, and by succeed I mean they tend to get overgrown faster. And this is where it comes back to your original design. Sometimes you choose your plants to match the size of the pond. And you can be clever about it if you like iris or bulrush or something that's going to get big and is naturally quite rapid growing. What you could do is plant them into the mud around the pond and not into the pond directly. So you're still offering that habitat. It's just not going to directly affect your pond. So there's a lot of ways of enhancing it that way through vegetation. And if anybody has any specific scenarios that they have and they'd like me to talk about, like, absolutely fire away, and we can go into it. It's just, it can be very subjective and broad when you're just saying, how do I enhance a pond? Because enhancing like a large pond is a much different animal than something that's significantly smaller, maybe in a garden or even on a balcony.
Mm. Go on, Sharon.
Can I just cut in because you sort of touched on one of the questions I was going to ask you, which is about with small ponds, and particularly liner ponds and ponds that are well away from wetland type sources, which is the case in a lot of the Burren. Sources of plants and potentially quarantining plants before you put them into your pond. What are your recommendations on that? And the reason I'm coming to that is I did a Hare's Corner visit last year, Plan for Nature, and somebody put in a new pond, had bought plants in a garden centre, one of which was lagrosiphon, which is illegal, I believe, to sell. And the other thing they had a lot of was the filmy fern. So that must have come in with their plant. And we've another person who bought a marsh marigold, and the pond ended up full of lagrosiphon again because something had come in. So maybe a bit on quarantining plants before you put them in.
Yeah, that's brilliant, Sharon, and absolutely needs to be considered. So I don't want to upset anybody who's in the trade, but horticulture has never engaged in any of the consultations or recommendations on invasive and non-native species in Ireland. They're still widely sold in garden centres under different names. Taxonomy changes regularly, and plants that are on the schedule shouldn't be traded. They just change the name on the label and it's something else, and then it's still marketed that way. But in terms of making sure you don't put something into your pond that you don't want there, I tend to quarantine any plants that I have to buy in, like, depending on the project. So like I have a couple of big projects coming up now, at the end of this week, and then again from the start of next week. I bought those plants in August, and they've been sitting in my garden outside since then. And I can monitor the growth before they go and hibernate for the winter. And now I'm monitoring now as they're waking up for this spring season. So I've essentially got, I've got 2 growth seasons where I can check and make sure there's nothing unwanted in with them as they come in, and I can remove them if possible. And then you have the winter diapause, because a lot of the invasive stuff, like, it doesn't tend to do very well when it's exposed to, ice and snow. Now, I live in the Wicklow Mountains, so, I get that far more regularly over the winter period than a lot of people at sea level now. There's no real winter period anymore. But that's the way I do it. I try and monitor them for as long as possible. At the very minimum, it's 2 weeks. Ideally, it would be a month, and ideally before that, it'd be a couple of months, just to check it. Keep it in a bucket. Anything that you don't want, like particularly filmy fern, like something like Azolla, you do not want that in a new pond. I have to go and visit a school now in a couple of weeks where they've put in a pond and they don't know what's wrong with it. And I said, well, what you tell me what the problem is? They said the surface is pink. So absolutely, it's all Azolla. The only way to control Azolla really is with the Azolla weevil. So, it's bio control. Azolla spreads by spores. So even if you drain the pond, the spores can still be there and it can come back. So it's usually the recommendation is infill it if you can't get hold of the weevil. And the weevil is all sorts of nonsense then. So, step one, don't buy Azolla. Absolutely check everything that you buy to make sure it's not in there. And if it is, like, remove it into a black bag and then into your bin. It's just really have to be, same with Largus Siphon. You just have to be vigilant. And I think it makes for better, it's almost like gardening, except you're just doing it in an aquatic landscape. If you're checking your plants, you're touching them, you're getting your hands in the soil, it's almost part of the process. So just, it's like a health check on your plants, like you would if you were doing it like aquaculture with fish and stuff. You would always check the health of your fish before they went in. So it's no different and unfortunately, we have to do this, even with native plants, because you don't know, urban parks in particular tend to be full of Elodea. And Elodea is fine at keeping water clean, but it will clog up your pond eventually. Things like parrot's feather, it's being sold as a Myrophyllum, which is, we have a native species in Ireland. The parrot's feather is like the South American cousin. It's much more heavy leaved, so it's a much thicker leaf. It's kind of almost like a waxy appearance. They're all being marketed under the same name or just as general oxygenator in inverted commas. So you have to be a little bit vigilant. Use your Google Lens if you're not sure what it is. But again, a bucket of rainwater for 2 weeks and, keep an eye on it yourself. That's really, you just have to be vigilant. It's like buying a pet. You have to do a health check on it, really. Because it's your reputation as well. Like for me as well, I couldn't be seen to be putting plants into a pond and then they're all of a sudden taken over by a particularly invasive one, so it wouldn't be good. I can see there's a lot of people there just coming in on the web chats there, Finn, as well. Are we going to answer these questions? Will you address this?
Yeah, I have a spin-off question from what we were just
Yeah.
talking about there first, which I suppose is like, well, one, I think, like, I would have thought, like, I think it planting, I would say, is still only for certain situations. Kind of like if you are in an area where you're going to get plants arriving naturally, I think just to wait and see is also like a really great strategy. Then you can avoid the whole, having to check for invasives and everything. But I wanted to ask if you actually have any suppliers for aquatic plants that like you trust.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. Because I still check all of my stuff that I sell as well.
Yeah.
I barely trust myself, barely, and I'm vigilant. I'm out there. I'll be out there later now with a head torch, having a look at plants and seeing what's in there, because sometimes it's easier to look at nighttime, when particularly for stuff that may not be emergent or floating on the surface. So yeah, it's tough. Like, you have Future Forests and you have like Clarenbridge Garden Centre, and you've got Newlands just there in Clondalkin. In Dublin, you've got Vanderwelds in Ockram, in Wicklow. All of these guys will, you have Seahorse Aquariums. Like, all of these guys are bringing in plants. Nearly 90% or more of the aquatic plants for sale are from the Netherlands.
Mm.
So that's just the fact of it. There's a small number of people that are growing Irish specimens within the Irish climate, but it's hard to get that stock, if you get me. You're also kind of limited here by collecting plants from the flower protection order. So you can't just go out and start nabbing stuff, unless they're not on the order. And even then, you should be careful because you don't want to destroy your local population of an oxygenator by wiping it out because you use it. Doesn't mean everybody else isn't there also collecting some, and it'll disappear very quickly, you know. So I think, it's one or two suppliers that are supplying everybody in Ireland. They're the ones with the pink labels. That's all I'm going to say. Um, so most people will see that, and a few of the bigger places like Future Forests and stuff are starting to grow their own, and it will and it should say on it that they've grown it themselves, in their premises, and that's kind of all I can say really, because you're never 100% sure that they're guaranteed Irish.
Mm.
But ideally you would hope they are if they're saying they are.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll move on to the questions then,
Yeah.
and I'll take them just in the order that they have come in. So the first one was that they put in a new pond and it's still just full of blanket weed and only a few pond plants. And they ask, will the tadpoles that have arrived be okay and have enough to eat?
Tadpoles will eat the algae. Algae's not the enemy, okay? And I was talking to somebody. I was on a golf course this morning, actually looking at a big pond there, because they were looking at biodiversity enhancement. So algae isn't the enemy, particularly at this time of year. Most of the native plants are dormant or they're just starting to wake up. Algae is still going to be creating oxygen and hammering that into the water and keeping your water well oxygenated at this time of the year. So cold water plus a little bit of algae generally means well oxygenated water, which should in turn mean you don't end up with green pea soup. You just end up with more algae until your plants wake up and then they can compete with the algae for the nutrients. Okay. Tadpoles are vegetarian right up until they start to develop their back legs. And then as soon as they start that kind of final couple of weeks towards metamorphosis is when they become more cannibalistic, and some tadpoles won't actually be able to make the whole change, because if you think of what a tadpole does, it essentially reconfigures its entire body shape into a froglet from a tadpole, which is a swimming sausage, right? They're just an intestine with a mouth and a tail on it. So they don't survive it. So the other tadpoles then start to scavenge its waste, not want not, so they become a little bit more carnivorous. So if there's tadpoles in your pond and it's just got algae and your plants are still kind of in hibernation, I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you think the plants aren't colonizing quick enough, have a look at your substrate. Do you have substrate in it? If so, what is it? Like if it's pond soil, you should be good enough. Like pond soil is essentially grit. It's very, very low nutrients. Is it subsoil from when you dug the pond? Sometimes that can be essentially like builder sand. It's got no nutrients at all in it. So that can also it's good as a rooting medium for the plants to anchor themselves. But if there's no nutrients there, it's not going to be overly attractive to new plants colonizing. So anything is better than just a liner, but it does kind of depend on the substrate that they're growing in as well. Like substrate is important because it's got beneficial bacteria. So that's why when I tell people, if you're using a rubber pond liner, use the potted plants. They're going to come with a little bit of fertilizer in them, specifically aimed at aquatic plants. There will be bacteria there because they have been grown in the water. And it's just a bit of a kickstart to the pond ecosystem that you're trying to create, And because the pond is new, it's going to take about 5 years for it to fully reach an equilibrium and a balance between giving it time for the plants to grow, and like some will grow quickly and some won't, and then sometimes the slow growers will outcompete the quick growers. You have to let it balance. If you keep fiddling at it, it'll never reach a balance, and that's usually when you start to have issues with algae, because sometimes you just got to leave it alone. So sorry for a bit of a long-winded answer, but again, it's one of those scenarios where it's not just one thing that could be causing your pond to develop slowly, if that's what you think it's doing.
Yeah. Yeah, no
Yeah.
worries. That was great. And so I just saw a question on what we were talking about just there before we get too far away from the plant, sourcing plants. Someone has asked if it would be possible to share one or two suppliers who are growing their own native plants, and asking, is Pink Label good or bad?
Pink Label is fine. So we'll start at the bottom, work our way up. Pink Label is grand. Um, they're Banna. They're another Dutch, so they're all Dutch companies. Um, and their plants tend to come in very good condition, especially when you get them just off the truck. You do need to be careful because they're grown in glass houses with loads of other stuff. Um, you still need to quarantine them, but they tend to be of excellent quality. They're just expensive now, and they've gone up again with diesel and everything else in the last week. So you're now looking at between where it was €4 or €5, you're now looking at between 6 and 10, depending on what aquatic plant you're looking at this year. So it's some of them have nearly doubled in price. It's ridiculous, and I can see that creating problems this year because price will then affect demand, which then will affect availability. And I can see there being slight issues now as everything could be gone by June if you get me. So if you're thinking of buying stuff, get ready to buy by the end of this month and into April. That would be my advice. So those guys. And then there's another crowd who have a blue label, and I can't remember the name of them. But I don't have labels. They're all outside my garden. I could run out and grab them. But most of them are actually okay. You just have to be vigilant because they're grown in these huge aquatic habitats in polytunnels because they have a much longer growing season then. And then, the plants are fully awake so that they can ship them in March, where the native ones in Irish ponds may still only be coming around, depending on the microclimate in the area. So, you'll go into nearly every garden centre in Ireland that sells aquatic plants and they'll all have that pink label. So, I wouldn't be overly concerned. It's more what you do with them for the 2 weeks after you buy them,
Mm,
just to check them. You know, like
great.
encouraging native plants into a pond that doesn't have a liner. So if you're on marl and or if you're in peaty soil or the water table's naturally high, um, they should come in quite rapidly, but it's not a guarantee. What you can have then is you can have things like floating sweetgrass and stuff will colonize and take over. And then you've got low diversity of aquatic plants. So sometimes you may need to add something just to keep the grass in check, to stop from being taken over, even in a native setting. So again, it's all about looking at your pond, knowing what's kind of local and what's in the area, and just keeping an eye on it because you don't want anything, even if it's a native species, you don't want one species dominating your whole pond. Um,
Mm,
so don't just walk away and let it go, at least for a couple of months while it's
mhm.
establishing. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Um, then a question from Ellen, which I might need expanded on, but we can start with that they're thinking of developing two ponds, and is there a way to do it without rubber liner, um, or building from scratch? I don't quite understand the last line, the last bit there, but certainly we can maybe tackle to line or to not to line. Um, and I have some other little follow-up questions on liners for you as
Okay.
well after that.
Yeah. Perfect. Absolutely. Okay. So a pond is just a hole in the ground that's then filled with something to hold the water in place so it doesn't escape, right? So how you go about doing that all depends on budget and, more importantly, your soil where you want to build the pond. So if you want to do it without using a rubber liner at all because you're against it, that's fair enough. You can use natural products that come kind of pre-bagged, so things like bentonite, sodium bentonite. It's a clay powder. I'm not being sexist, but for ladies' face masks, those clay face masks that women put on their face to keep their skin lovely and smooth, and men, I suppose, in some situations, you can buy that. And what happens essentially is that will absorb water and expand up to 12 times its particle size. So it seals all the gaps in your soil and then holds the water in place. The water can't get out. So we used this on a project in a proposed natural heritage area in Sandyford just in November gone. and we used a ton of bentonite to reline 5 small ponds because it was a proposed natural heritage area. We couldn't be bringing in artificial liners, so we redid it all in bentonite, and it seems to work. It's very good. It's a great way of trialing something and getting really dirty and messy because you put it on nearly like a plaster. It's great crack, but it does get everywhere because it is heavy clay, and it's very pure. So it's like pottery grade clay that you end up with once it's wet. It's so heavy and messy, and it's fantastic at doing its job. And eventually, like in some places, you can talk to people. It takes about 5 years for it properly to be worked into the base and sides of your pond, so that um, all the sealing is kind of done underneath rather than just sitting on the top, because it can look very grey and kind of stark and kind of almost kind of scares people when they see it when it first goes in. So that's one way of doing it. The other natural clay you can use is marl. So North Wexford, South Wicklow, into parts of Carlow, some parts of Offaly. In Offaly, they call the marl, they call it the lacquer. So that's just a heavy kind of layer of yellow or blue clay, depending on where you are. Again, it'd be high quality clay. And what you need then is, and the same with the bentonite, you need kind of 5 to 10 centimeters thickness of that to go down over your soil, particularly if you're on very well draining sandy or rocky soil as well, because you need to form a seal so that the water can't get out. So they're your only real ways of doing it without using an artificial liner, whether it's a pre-molded plastic tub or it's EPDM. The only thing I can say about EPDM is it is rubber, so it was natural product at one stage. Generally, most of it is made from recycled tires now. Some people will tell you it's recycled Formula One tires. So it could be the third or fourth life of this particular project by the time it gets turned into pond liner. With things like bentonite, it's mined, so it's taken out of the ground and then kiln dried and then sieved and powderized, and or it's you can buy it in little nuggets. There's no bentonite in Ireland. It's all coming from the very far east of Europe and southern Europe. So in terms of global footprint, there's a significant mining element and then a shipping element. And then with the marl, you got to get an excavator in. So you are digging and using heavy machinery, and then it has to be usually shipped by the dumper truck to your location, because you do need that 5 to 10 centimeters thickness, over quite a large pond. You're looking at truckloads of marl, so there is a significant, environmental cost about when that much clay is excavated from one or two particular borrow pits, as they call them, in North Wexford or wherever you're getting it from. So, you kind of need to sit down and think like what's the least environmental impact and what's best for you. The EPDM lasts forever, more or less, if you protect it with the pond fleece. And there is the option, if the pond ever had to be moved or relocated, that you could drain all your wildlife and water into like big collection tanks, roll up your pond, and then move it somewhere else and reuse the same liner. And it'll still be good as gold in 25, 30 years' time. Whereas you can't take, well, you could, but taking your marl or taking your bentonite with you is going to be a much more messy affair. So, there are considerations when it comes to how you're going to build your pond and what material you're going to use. In terms of pricing, they're all much of a muchness these days. It'll all work out around the same price, unless you're already sitting on a heavy clay soil, which will be
Mm-mm.
cheap and free because you have it under your feet. So,
Yeah. And um, like liner is so expensive now. Like, do you have any tips for getting liner cheaper, or like, do you have like a best place that you use? I know you buy a lot of it, so anywhere that you source it, that's particularly good.
um, buy lots of it. So if it's multiple community groups, almost become a co-op for your materials. Because if you buy an entire roll, so I'd use like the most common kind of width of pond liner that I'd use was be 6 meters wide. Okay. And that comes on a 30 meter roll. But each 1 meter squared weighs about a kilo. So you're looking at 180 kilos plus the cardboard and stuff. So you're looking at roughly 200 kilos in a rail liner. So it's heavy. So that's shipped in these big spirals. So if you had somewhere where it could be shipped to, and then you unwind it and cut it as you need it, that's brilliant. But if you've got 3 or 4 or 5 groups all going in together, your 30 meters by 6 meters wide isn't going to go. It's not going to last very long if everybody's doing the minimum pond size that Hare's Corner recommends, which is the 25 square meters, the
Mm.
5 by 5. So, you would get discount by buying the whole roll. You might only pay maybe 14 or 15 euros per square meter on it,
Okay.
and if you're lucky, that may include VAT. And if you're not, that might push it up over into the 16.50, 17 euros margin, which is still far cheaper than in some places buying it. And the thing is, what you want for that price point is 1.02 millimeters EPDM. It's essentially, you could drive track machinery across this and it'd be very hard for it to puncture it. Like, this stuff is top quality. It's the best of the best that you can get. And if you just use the pond fleece above it and below it to protect it from tree roots and sharp rocks or anything you may have missed, downward gravity, somebody dropping a heavy ornamental stone into it, it's very, very difficult to puncture, unless you're being a complete pork chop about it and doing something really silly, So it is worth the money to buy.
Mm.
Geoline in Waterford are very good, and they have, all sorts of widths, and they do a 0.75 thickness for somebody who might be in a low impact area, or on quite sandy soil, where the bedrock and tree roots and stuff mightn't be an issue. Or your price point, like 0.75 mil EPDM, is still heavy duty. It's very, very tough to break.
Mm.
So Geoline would be good for that. Seahorse in Ballymount Industrial Estate, they're offering like native wildlife pond materials now as well. They'd be competitive. Rock World and Alan in Allenwood in Kildare, he is excellent as well. Provides top class materials. Pond Hobby over towards Donabate and Ballyboggle on the north side in Fingal. He would be very, very good there. John he'd be excellent, and he'd be another man where you could rock up any day of the week or give him a call, and he'd have multiple widths and lengths available. Most of them are selling Owassi or what are they, Firebridge type liners. Like, they're all branded. Owassi are just the Dutch brand who make an awful lot of it, but it's all the same product.
Mm.
So that's, buy more and you get a discount. It's the same with everything. But I'll imagine with the carry-on going on in Iran at the moment, because it's imported, it's going to get more expensive. So if anybody's thinking of doing it, I would do it sooner rather than later.
Mm. So that's, you said 1.2 millimeters EPDM.
0.02. Yeah, you can get thicker than that, but that's
0.02.
for like lining things like dams and reservoirs and, huge, heavy
Yeah.
engineering, not really necessary for, community or garden ponds or even agricultural ponds or whatever. They're seriously heavy duty stuff,
Yeah.
you know. Like
Yeah.
1.02 normally is good enough for everybody in this
Yeah.
in this kind of line of work, where you're looking at nature positive actions rather than, making a new drinking reservoir for Dublin City or something instead of piping to Shannon.
Yeah. I'll just put that in the chat so everybody can get that, and the suppliers you mentioned as well. And the clays that you mentioned, um, like, where would
The
you source
bentonite
those?
is like the sodium bentonite.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a couple of companies that sell it. The crowd called Round Tower, they're in Cork. They sell it, and price point is the same. It just depends where in Ireland, um, you know, uh, where you are, and makes it more feasible because it's heavy. A
Mm.
pallet of it weighs a ton. They're 25 kilo bags, or you can buy it in big 1 ton bags. It's whatever's cheapest on delivery for you. So there's Round Tower, and then there's I think it's Clearwater. Where are they? Is it sorry, I'm just gonna have a quick now. I think they're called Clearwater. They're over in Baldoyle, industrial estate in the north side of Dublin, and they would be huge importers of yeah, it's clearwater.ie. It would be really importers because sodium bentonite is also used to lubricate drill heads when you're putting in pilings and foundations for new buildings. But they're happy to sell, to people like me, to like one-offs. You don't have to be a trader. They'll sell it to community groups. They're happy to take anybody's money. And they will have a variety of options for it as well. And it's more or less all the same stuff. Some of it might have a fancy name called hydrogel or, dam proofing or any of this kind of stuff, but it's all sodium bentonite. It's all the exact same stuff. Once it gets wet, it will swell and make this big thick grey paste, and that's what's going to keep your water in place.
Um, Great. And okay, we have so many questions. 1 second. So yeah, I'll go back to the top of the list. And so we don't miss any. So someone has asked, can you move tadpoles from an urban pond to a rural one?
Ideally not, unless your urban pond is right on the border with your rural area. So so you need a license technically from National Parks and Wildlife to move spawn anywhere. Okay, so that's the legality of the whole thing. If you want frogs in your area, generally you just make sure that your pond is accessible to them, and normally they will find a way in, even if they're up to, like, the nearest population is a kilometer away. You shouldn't move tadpoles because you're at risk of the donor population could be negatively affected if you're collecting spawn and or tadpoles, and B, you could potentially be transmitting disease as well into your pond inadvertently that you don't know about. And then if wild frogs then turn up 2 or 3 years later, because it can take them a while to find your pond, now all of a sudden they've been infected by whatever it is you've transported in, and then you can, if the tadpoles you've brought in metamorphose and start to breed with the local population, you can dilute down their locally adapted gene pool and all things like that. So I don't really recommend it, irrespective of the legalities of it and whether you care about needing licenses to do this kind of stuff. From a zoological point of view and an ethical point of view, you shouldn't. If you're in a rural area, there's a very good chance there's frogs somewhere nearby. It just might take them a year or two to find your pond. And that's the beauty of things like the National Biodiversity Data Centre. You can jump onto their website. So if you go to biodiversitymaps.nbdc, I think it's .ie, you can just stick in the species that you're looking for and see if there's any in your area. It's a very, very simple thing that you can search. I do it all the time when I'm doing consultancy, just to see what's in an area, to see what the pond may or may not be benefiting, to see what's already in the area and potentially may colonize and things like that. So it's a free to use resource. And that would be the place to start before you even think about, becoming a tadpole fairy and moving them around. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Yeah, someone has commented no rural resettlement for tadpoles, so no.
Definitely
But
no funding for that. Yeah.
no. And then yes, another person has asked what are the best Irish water plants to introduce into a newly established pond. I'd say, I mean, I assume it just depends on the size, where you are, what your preference is.
Yeah.
Um,
I would go with the best Irish water plants not to introduce into your newly established pond. Stay away from anything that gets tall. So keep your irises out, keep the bulrush in particular out, keep your Phragmites reeds out. If it's a small pond, low and colourful would be my sales pitch. Things like water forget me not, your marsh marigolds, your Veronica Beccabunga, all of these lovely kind of low growing um, plants that are excellent because they put these feeding rhizomes and roots into the water column, and the bacteria on the rhizomes is actually what's taking the nutrients out of the water and keeping it clean. And then that feeds the plant, and then the plant gets bigger, so its nutrient demand is greater, and then your water is cleaner and cleaner, and it's this kind of positive feedback cycle. So that's what I'd say. Keep the big ones out and the low, colourful ones in. The only exception to that rule would be purple loosestrife, and that's only because I love it. And it doesn't get higher than hard and kind of waist height, but when you're heading towards the end of summer and you just need that kind of slap of color in the face, there's nothing like a 1 meter tall, hot pink flower just to kind of keep it going and keep that summer vibes going. And you can tailor it, like Marsh marigolds are starting to flower now in a lot of
Yeah.
places. So you have that shocky yellow first thing in the year. And then, the water forget-me-nots will start going towards late spring, early summer. So now you've got this lovely little tiny blue flower with a little yellow fried egg center on it. And then, the Brookline, the Veronica, that puts out those lovely little lilac-y flowers from kind of June right the way through into September. So, any of those would be are brilliant and get them in. Just avoid the big invasive ones. It's just going to create a headache for you. So low, small, and colourful are the way to do it, I think.
Mm. What about water lilies? Where do they fall on the spectrum?
Water lilies get huge.
Yeah.
So we normally recommend for one 5 by 5 meter pond, one native, one Nymphea alba, so the native water lily, the white one, with the little yellow center. One of those will do a 5 by 5 meter pond. Now you'll buy them and they'll be young plants and they'll be small, but they will no, they're like a puppy. They won't stay small for long. And they are fantastic for your pond. They're great at using a lot of nutrients because they grow so quick. Um,
Mm.
but you only need one, or you could go for the new fir, the lutea. They like very deep water. They're all leaf and that tiny little kind of like
Yeah.
candle head. You tend to see them more in canals. But one of either. You don't need any more than that per
Yeah.
25 meters squared. They do not, they take up a huge amount of space like one plant. So what we would do, so we're going to do a couple of formal ponds in St. Anne's Park in Raheny now with the Tidy Towns group and Dublin City Council at the end of this month. They would like a lily, because you can grow lilies in barrel ponds. There's no problem that they will take over the entire barrel pond, but they will look incredible. We're just going to keep them in baskets. The basket will kind of restrict growth, so they'll grow much slower. And it just means that when they start to creep up, and you notice I said when, not if, when the rhizomes start to come up over the top of the basket and come down, and iris will do this as well, as will bulrush, you can hike out the whole hike out the whole basket and just chop up some of the roots to try and contain it and keep its growth in check. So, with the formal ponds where, accessing the actual baskets and things is much easier than maybe in a wilder, or semi-wild deeper pond. It's a really good way to control the growth and kind of keep it in check. And then if you're going to basketize it, all you have to consider then is you treat it like a rhubarb. You have to let it get old enough that it flowers. And then if it stops flowering after like 7 or 8 years, it means it's root bound. So it's a bit like daffodils and rhubarb. So what you do is you take it out, you chop it in half with a spade, put one half back into the basket, and that'll be brand new and it'll start for all over. And then you've got a spare water lily now that's adapted to a Irish microclimate, and give it to somebody else. Somebody else nearby that may have just put in a pond or is looking for a lily.
Mm.
You know, everything is the long term. You're always kind of this 5 to 10 year game with everything.
Yeah.
Letting it grow, letting it flower, thinking about having to manage it and maybe move some of it onwards.
Mm.
Yeah, so that's it with lilies. One is enough for most plants, unless it's massive.
Yeah. And no, please, no non-native water lilies, everybody. Every pond we go to, we see, not every, but many, many ponds. The native ones are so nice anyway, so
Yeah,
just stick to those. Um, and okay, where are we then? Someone asked when we say small pond, how small is small? I mean, we do ponds. We have done ponds in the past, for schools and things with not a lot of space that are sort of 1 by 2 meters. Rob, you've
yeah,
probably done ones that are that or even smaller. I mean,
yeah. We're doing barrel ponds now, so that there's a fantastic project in Crumlin Kimmage there near the Poddle. Um, and Dave rolled out the Kingfisher project. So Dave rolled out an initiative for members and residents in the area to collect rainwater, which is nature-based solution that everybody should be doing. It's just so effective and easy to do. But they did it with barrels that were provided by Dublin City Council by way of Diageo. They were the ones they weren't good enough even to be used as street tables anymore. So they just cut them in half and they donated it to the group. And then we did a workshop last spring on it, and we just said, okay, for the ones that weren't watertight anymore or liquid tight anymore, you just line the inside of them with a bit of rubber liner so that they held water. And then, you know, 60 liters, 65 liters is what they'll hold. Put 4 plants in there, 4 aquatic plants of your choice. You can buy these little hook on baskets now so that you can put, like, marginal or emergent plants that like to be, right at the surface, or like the tiny amount of water just under the surface. And you just hook them onto the edge. And that works really well, or else grow one solitary lily in it. And what I say to people is, if you're going to do a barrel pond, because they work really well because they're wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. So your surface area to depth ratio is actually, it's your surface is so much bigger than the narrow base. Light does penetrate it quite well, but because it's an ornamental feature, get white stone. So you can get like quartz, and you can get like polished marble, like all the ornamental stuff you see for, like, even for gravestones, and stuff. Put a layer of that in the bottom of your barrel, and the light bounces around, like it reflects off the leaves. It will reflect off the white stones in the bottom, and it just makes the entire water column, then it just lifts it because there's light down there. And then you can think of things like hornwort, which is a native oxygenator. Hornwort and spiked milfoil are the two really good oxygenators. You can actually anchor them to the base, and because the white stone is reflecting the light around down there, they will actually photosynthesize and oxygenate your water barrel and keep it fresh and stop it going stagnant. And you just top it up from your either your rain butt that it's attached to, or your water gutter. So it's a really simple, effective way. So in terms of small pond, it can be something like 65 liters. It could be as small as an old washing up tub. You know, the most important thing to consider is your surface area to depth ratio. Your surface area always has to be greater than the maximum depth of whatever it is you're going to try and store your water in. That's why rectangular stuff tends to work well, because it's open at the top, and they tend to be quite shallow compared to the surface area that it's offering. And that's why these kind of beer barrel, whiskey barrel things work quite well as well, because it's quite open at the top, so a lot of light can get in even to the base, which might be 30 to 60 centimeters, depending on the size of the barrel deep. Um, and if you compare that to a natural pond, or a pond that's very good for wildlife, the aim is to kind of a 30 to 60 centimeter maximum depth. We're not Canada, we're not going to freeze solid. Most of your wildlife lives between the edge and 30 centimeters deep. So if you're offering a whiskey barrel that you've now converted into a garden pond, and it's 30 centimeters deep, you're laughing. So don't underestimate small ponds for small spaces. You'll attract hoverflies, dragonflies. You mightn't get frogs in it. You may get frogs in it. If you wanted, so there was a lady that had frogs in her garden, and she wanted them to go into the barrel because she had fish in the garden pond. So what she did was she placed the barrel pond up against where she had a raised border, and then just built up the back of the pond with some stone, so the frogs had a way to get in, and then they could use the hook on hangers, the hook on planters, then to get out. So the frogs had a way of getting out of the pond. But if you were looking at it dead on, it would just look, for all intents and purposes, like you were looking straight out of a barrel. It was only the backside that you couldn't see that had been built up like a ramp, so that the frogs had access. Really inventive way of incorporating it into the garden. And again, a lot of this is about your own artistic flair, and your own way of designing and thinking about things and what you actually want. So there's no one way of doing this, or no one way of doing a wildlife pond. There's a million ways to do it. Essentially, you're creating, or you're using a container, or you're creating a hole, and you're going to do something that's going to hold the water that you want in place, and then you're going to use plants or whatever to attract in your wildlife. And that's it. Everything else is artistic flair and personal preference.
Mm-hmm. Great. We are getting near the end. I have one question I want to ask you on that, which is, you're talking about oxygenators.
Yeah.
And I suppose, like, people ask us this a lot. Like, do ponds actually need oxygenators? Or is that only for ponds that have kind of just stagnant water sitting in them, like a barrel or something?
Most ponds will do far better when you have some form of oxygenator in it.
Mm,
So, oxygenator is a term that garden centers use to sell specific type of plants. Anything that grows underwater is producing oxygen and putting it into the water column. Like algae is an oxygenator. Okay, um, just deeper ponds. So if you have a well in the middle of, so if you have a deeper part of a pond that you've created, and I recommend most do because it's like a safety zone in terms of drought and also in terms of extreme cold. Um, Everything moves into it and out of it depending as how they need it or need to get safe. If you if it's open enough and the light's able to penetrate to the base, which it should be if they're only kind of that 50 to 60 centimeters deep, your oxygenators are down there and they'll be happy down there and they'll just bubble oxygen all the way up through the water column. So I recommend things like starwort, fantastic there. So they're all the Caltrichi species. They come in a million varieties. You've got like fat lobed, you've got skinny, spiny lobed type ones. So there's the vulgaris, there's the palustris, there's a few others. You get giant forms of them. You can nearly plant them into the side of your deep bit, and then they form these like underwater cushions and newts and things like that. Love them because they can sit on top, which is slightly warmer because it's near the surface. And then if they feel scared, they can retreat right into the middle of them. It's a bit like a coral in a coral reef, just in terms of instead of a freshwater, we're looking at it from a freshwater point of view. So there's loads of different plants that are oxygenators that are also, they're keeping the water clean, they're keeping the water oxygenated, which in turn keeps all of your wildlife, happy and healthy. And it also, it stops it from going stagnant and smelly. Oxygen tends to kill off the bacteria that makes your pond stinky.
mm.
So I would recommend that every pond has at least one or two types of oxygenator in there.
Great. We'll do maybe one or two quick fire questions
Yeah.
and then we'll wrap up. So someone has asked, can they use sort of waste potter's clay to fix a hole in their leaky pond? I would say go
If
for
you
it.
if you know where the hole is, absolutely give it a go because I was in a project there in Wexford this year where they had a concrete lined pond and there was a big crack and it was going to cost a fortune to redo the concrete and then it'd have to be sealed and everything. So what we did was, if in doubt, add bentonite and all we did was sprinkle it. So as the water was escaping out through the crack, it was pulling the clay into the hole with it, and then it would swell over time. So little by little, we were actually sealing it with the bentonite clay. I don't see how the leftover potter's clay would be any different. You might just struggle to get it to adhere first, but I'd keep at it. It's
Yeah.
worth a shot. Worst case, it doesn't work, but at least you've tried.
Yeah. And then someone asking, can you protect the EPDM with soil that you've excavated? Um,
Yeah, you can. I would still put down a line of like at the worst case, doesn't have to be pond fleece, but at least gardening fleece over the EPDM. The soil you've excavated, you have to know that it's subsoil. If you put in, and I've seen this done recently on a big industrial estate where they've put the topsoil back in, and you know it was never subsoil. Like you can see, there's a distinct color change when it gets nutrient poor. Like your subsoil tends to be a kind of a much paler color than the top layer where your rich kind of growing topsoil is. If you put topsoil back in, all you've done now is introduce a ridiculous level of nutrients into your pond ecosystem, and it's just going to turn green. Um,
mm,
so just be careful. Yes, you can use it, but just make sure it's subsoil, it's nutrient poor subsoil that you're putting back in, and use a bit of pond fleece or a bit of gardening fleece just additionally to protect the liner in case there's something like builder's rubble or there's pottery or something you don't know in there that you haven't seen, or sharp stone or something, like particularly if you're near granite or quartzite or something, because they get very, very sharp, and the last thing you want to do is go to all that effort to just put a hole in it in the last stage, the final
yeah.
stages, because that will wreck your head and it's an expensive mistake to make.
We've seen people having to, redo their pond and it's just not worth it. Like just protect the liner.
No,
It's not worth redoing it. If
it's
you're
a,
really averse, I think, to paying for liner. Like you can use, say, one thing is that now like farmers shearing sheep, like the wool is basically worthless. So they're like giving it away. They're happy for you to take it away. So if you're rural and you know any sheep farmers, just you can ask for some fleece or something like that. Like,
Yeah.
yeah, there are alternatives.
Just be careful with the fleece because it's not woven. Tree roots can get through it. Whereas
Yeah.
with the geotextile pond fleece, it's almost it's absolute bugger even with a sharp scissors to cut it. Like so, it's very makes life very difficult for tree roots and stuff to get through. Whereas old bits of carpet and builder sand and other stuff we see recommended online, tree roots will be through it in a second, or just the weight of the pond pushing down. The way
Mm,
stones always make their way to the surface. It's the same when you've excavated for a pond. Nothing's there, and then all of a sudden there's a bit of weight in it. And if you're in walking around in your socks just before you start to fill it, and you're smoothing the liner into places, then all of a sudden you're like, "Where's that stone come from?" Now I feel a sharp spot under my foot here, so the whole thing has to be, rolled back off so that you can excavate this stone again. So yeah, just don't skimp because it's not worth the headache.
yeah.
It really isn't.
We'll leave it there. Do you want to add anything, Rob or Sharon?
Yeah, I'm just looking through the questions here. I could go at this all day. Can I do it really quickly? Caroline, the star effect plant. Absolutely. That's a starwort. That's the Kiltrique species that I was talking about. Take a little bit of the mud with you if you're gonna excavate it. But they are fantastic. They're oxygenators. They make great microhabitats. So nuts. Don't add too much though, because it goes quite um yeah, so don't be shy, but you don't need loads of it. Think about, for every square meter of pond, you might only need four, like little small, like just if you're measuring pasta, in between your index finger and your thumb, four bits of plants that size for every square meter of your pond will do you. And it's a great place to get your pond ecosystem up and running. Have a go. Just quickly here. Yeah. And no, for Mary Barton, your non-line pond, doing your quarter to one third clearance, the end of year 5, or unless something's gotten unruly and got out of hand and is growing really, really quickly, I would leave your pond alone and let it reach a balance first, and that could take 5 years. Ponds are supposed to be low maintenance. So just go out and enjoy it and watch it colonize and watch things establish and arrive. So I would leave it alone for years 1 and 2, absolutely. Maybe years 3 and 4, something's grown particularly vigorous, but otherwise, year 5 is when you may start to think about managing it. And for everybody, pond maintenance, kind of mid to late November until the end of January, early February, before the frogs and newts start moving. It's the best time to do your clearance. Get your any extra leaf litter layer, any stuff that's gone in over the winter, scoop it all out, because it means there's less food for the algae to feed on before the plants wake up. So you're less likely to have a major algal bloom. If you manage leaf litter and anything else that's providing excess nutrients to the system while the plants are asleep. Land with reeds
Can I just
grow. Yeah, go for it there, Sharon. Sorry, I'm just
I
going
was
through
just
this.
going to come back into that very first question, which kind of got diverted from of boosting biodiversity value of a pond, sort of for the surrounding things like log piles and stone piles to give protection for the frogs and newts to go into. And if you can connect your pond into other cover and habitats around, and even when you're thinking about your pond, we tend to think about it above surface, but to increase its biodiversity value, you want to make it more complex below the surface. So a lot of it is about how the plants are growing below the surface, maybe adding bits of wood and other things that are going to give a variation of structure.
Yeah, and if you're adding wood, make sure it's well seasoned and not treated timber or anything like that. If you put in freshly cut sticks, with willow, you need to be careful because the thing will burst back
Right.
into life, and then you're dealing with a different problem. But if it's cut wood and it's fresh, the bark and stuff will rot and they will add nutrients. Whereas at least if it's been seasoned, you can put it in. And but even leaving your plants, like some of the woodier ones, leave the bits of dead leaf in there because, like dragonflies and things, some of the species will only lay their eggs into the dead wood or into the dead leaf part of the plant, and then when they hatch out, they go in. But if there's none of that there or available, they'll completely avoid your pond entirely. So this is why most people I will tell that if you put in a pond, leave it alone for a few years, let things happen naturally. Don't. It's not an aquarium. You're not you're not in like a Japanese aquarium stylist competition. And doesn't all have to be neat and tidy and proper. It's not Victorian gardening we're getting into here. Let it kind of do its own thing. For the first couple of years and just watch it. You know. And it's important to watch it in case something comes in from outside, may have been brought in on birds' feet or everything, and then so if there's a species gets in that you don't want in there, you can manage it. Particularly something like willow, which you don't want growing in your pond, or something like Elodia turns up for some reason, maybe a duck or something brought it in with it, get it out ASAP. So monitoring is important. Just be vigilant, but also use while you're enjoying it, use that as an opportunity to keep an eye on it as well.
All right. Anything else?
Land for Mary, land with reeds growing. How could it be optimized for a pond habitat? So reed beds with 10 to 20 centimeters of water all the time is fantastic habitat for a lot of the birds. So you could actually create reed bed with little open water pockets so that the birds have somewhere to feed. Like I'm thinking like water rails, and we don't get turns in Ireland, but like they like that kind of reedy habitat where there's permanent water in it. So you absolutely could do it. And the reeds will keep your water very clean. And they'll be huge to things like reed bunting's huge habitat provision. To things like reed bunting, you could get snipe and other things hanging around the edges of them too. So it really depends on what you're trying to attract. Just scoop out a place right in the middle of your reeds. Let it fill with water if you can. If you have to ram the earth to ensure the water stays there, and then the reeds nearby will just they'll spread their seeds in, and you'll have a wet reed bed in no time. So that would be the way to do it. Yeah, Ellen, you were definitely breaking the law 40 years ago, bringing tadpoles to school in your jam jar. For anybody who's thinking of bringing them into school, there is for frogs, tadpoles into school. There's a general license. You just download it. It's a PDF from the National Parks and Wildlife website. You download it, and all it says is you agree to the tadpoles and the froglets back the same place where you collected the spawn, whether whenever they're ready to go back or whenever the kids are fed up with them or you're fed up with them. So, they go back into the same gene pool, and you should let your local ranger know that you're taking part in it. Otherwise, there's no paperwork to be filled out. You just go online and download it. So, absolutely, we should be getting frogs definitely back into the classroom again. It's one of the most simple and easy things to do. You can rear them in a plastic tub if you don't want glassware, like an aquarium in the classroom. We've done it for a few schools in Finglas, and it worked really, really well. Like at one stage, between Finglas, Donamead, and Terranure, we had like 560 kids rearing tadpoles for us one year as a trial project for Dublin City Council. Brilliant, so good, such good fun. So yeah, absolutely get them back in for the nature table in school. And that's it. If anybody else has any questions, yeah, give me a shout before we run away.
I think we'll leave it there. Let everybody go to bed, or let me go to bed anyway. It's getting near my bedtime. I thanks so much, Rob, for
Yes.
answering all those questions. That was really fab. I feel like I learned so much, and thanks for doing it at such short notice as well. We'll have to have you back for a proper clinic again sometime where you can tell us about the work you've been doing and give a bit more detail. I'm going to put up some links in the chat, including the link to the Antoshka Ponds for Biodiversity project, in case anybody is interested. They've got great resources on ponds. And then the next clinic is April 13th, I think, at 8 p.m. again, and we're going to be doing managing invasive plants. Not so much ponds, but more terrestrial invasive plants. So for anybody who's interested, the link to register for that is there. So yeah, final word is the mandatory membership call, which is that this project is obviously run by Burn Bio Trust. So if you want to support the work that we do, we'd love for you to become a member. And that's it. Yeah. Thanks, Sharon, and thanks, Rob. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. Go.
Yeah, thanks,
Have
Rob.
a rest, Finn, will you? Thanks, Sharon. Yeah,
Bye.
and if anybody needs to talk to me, like, you know how to get me, so I'm happy to field questions. So
Thanks, Rob. Yeah.
go and have a rest.
Bye, everybody.
See you later.